I didn't think there was anything wrong with my steadiness on my feet. Maybe I need to think twice about that. I do know that there's something wrong with my voice, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for that generous introduction. It is a pleasure to join you this evening for an open discussion on a topic of growing concern in both Turkey and the United States, and if anything, of even more urgent importance elsewhere in the Middle East, in countries I scarcely need to mention. Our announced topic is reflections on religion and nationalism, a linked pair of subjects about which, of course, a great deal can be said. This evening, though, God has sent me a message to listen more than I speak by taking away most of my voice. Not only am I going to leave more time for discussion than I originally planned, and you look like a lively group. I don't think we'll have too much trouble getting started. I'm also going to ask my friend Kitty Crary to take over for me in a moment to read the remainder of my written remarks so that I may save my voice for the question and answer period. Here at the outset, however, let me express in my own voice my warm interest, deep respect, and long-term optimism that the course the Pacifica Institute is charting here in Southern California and through the Fethullah Gulen movement in Turkey and around the world is indeed the best and wisest path for the world in the 21st century. What I mean by that is that the path ahead must combine, on the one hand, liberal patriotism and liberal intellectualism, and on the other hand, religious tradition. It is the integration of these two, not their segregation, much less the suppression of either in the name of the other, that promises the needed combination of creativity and continuity. What this means in the Muslim majority countries of the world is that the path forward must lead neither away from Islam nor from the West, but only through Islam and beyond the West to a new way of life in which these countries will be copies neither of some Western country nor of their own imagined past.
We'll try it that way. At this juncture, what we are talking about when we speak of religion and nationalism is religious and national identity. Identity, the answer to the question, who am I, has more components than just these two. I may tell you that I am a Christian and an American, thus naming for you my religion and nationality. But gender plays a large part in identity too, does it not? I am a man and not a woman. Now remember here, I am only the messenger tonight. Sexual orientation, education, wealth, all these play a part, perhaps wealth most of all. In my opinion, segregation by relative wealth may be the most carefully enforced of all forms of segregation in the United States. Occupation, too, can shape identity profoundly. Imagine all that follows from answers as different as, I am an artist, I am a builder, I am a soldier, I am a farmer. But when I say that religion and nationality are important components in personal identity, I need not claim that they are important to the exclusion of all else. Moreover, I am free to add, as I do add, that they are particularly important just now in certain regions of the world, notably including the Middle East. The word identity is an interesting word in English. Like most words in this language, it has its origin in another language. In this case, in the Latin language, and in particular, in the late form of Latin that was spoken in the medieval European universities. European philosophy, as it developed in those universities, developed a technical vocabulary, partly by coining abstract nouns from simple Latin roots. The root from which the Latin term identitas was coined was the Latin pronoun idem, meaning same. Your identitas, your identity, was that which made you the same person over time, even though you went through great changes. A little boy named Abdullah grows to be a tall and powerful man. Is he still Abdullah despite the difference in his appearance? Yes, despite the changes, he is still Abdullah. And the name for that about him, which remains the same, is identity. Let me now mention a second interesting word in English. Again, a word borrowed from another language, this time Greek. The word is crisis, derived ultimately from the ancient Greek word, a verb, kritain, to choose. The moment of crisis always proves to be the moment of a significant choice. The crisis moment we have all been hearing about lately is December 31st, 2012, the moment when the temporary tax cuts enacted by President George W. Bush and extended for a year by President Barack Obama expire with significant consequences for the American economy. Though significant, the consequences this budget crisis do not make, though significant, the consequences of this budget crisis do not make it yet a crisis of identity. By and large, the American people will be, and understand themselves to be, the same people on the far side of the budget crisis, however it is resolved, that we understand ourselves to be now. But identity crises, to combine the two words just introduced, identity and crisis, do occur in the lives of nations, just as they do in the lives of individuals. Choices that do indeed affect the question, who am I, face not only individuals, but also nations, at which point the question they are forced to answer becomes, who are we? At such moments of national identity crisis, it's essential to muster not just the creativity and courage to change what must be changed, but also the humility and again the creativity to preserve what must not be lost. If, as the crisis is resolved, the nation is still able to recognize itself as the same nation. A man may ask of himself, what will I have accomplished if I manage a great and profound change, but on the far side of that change, I find that I myself have disappeared in the process? The prospect of such a disappearance, of such an annihilation or alienation of the self in the course of a drastic adaptation is a terrifying prospect, and only the more so when it involves not just one individual, but millions simultaneously. What then is the underlying strength of an alliance between religious tradition and liberal intellectualism? It is, in my judgment, the marriage of two indispensable capacities: the capacity to change and the capacity to remain the same. Broadly speaking, religion is everywhere ancient. It has great capacity to remain the same over time as compared to other institutions. For this reason, among others, a national religion can be powerfully stabilizing in the life of a nation, whether it's legally established or merely widely embraced. But it's only rarely that necessary adaptation emerges from religious institutions. Far more commonly, the needed adaptation emerges elsewhere, but becomes successful and is fully implemented only when and as it is embraced by the religious institutions in the region where it emerged. You'll see from this line of argumentation why I'm encouraged by the promise of the Pacifica Institute and the school of thought from which it emerges. Albert Einstein once wrote, "Religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame." What Einstein said of science so often seems true of other forms of secular intellectualism as well. Science has successfully assembled evidence of climate change, global warming, for example, that will destroy the human habitat if the world remains on its current course. But science has been helpless, lame in Einstein's sense of the word, in attempting to motivate the world to act on this knowledge. By contrast, should the religions of the world ever embrace the salvation of the world habitat as a sacred cause, they would be unstoppable. But will they in time? Let me turn now from these very general, very psychological or psycho-historical reflections to the particular situation we face just now in the Middle East. We are approaching, as you know, the 100th anniversary of the First World War, which led to the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and a redrawing of the map of the Arab Middle East to specifications determined by the British and the French, with little attention to tribal boundaries and less still to religious boundaries. David Frumkin, in a well-received book entitled A Peace to End All Peace, says that the broadest mistake the British in particular made when dealing with the Arabs was to systematically overestimate the importance of national identity and to systematically underestimate the importance of religion in the minds and lives of the population affected by those new borders. But are we now on the verge of a redrawing of those borders? And how will ethnic, tribal, and religious elements combine if we are? Just a week ago, writing in the New York Times, the columnist Thomas L. Friedman wrote, "Syria is the keystone of the Middle East. If and how it cracks apart could recast this entire region. The borders of Syria have been fixed ever since the British and French colonial powers carved up the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. If Assad is toppled and you have state collapse here, Syria's civil war could go regional and challenge all the old borders, as the Shiites of Lebanon seek to link up more with the Alawite Shiites of Syria. The Kurds in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey tried to link up with one another and create an independent Kurdistan. And the Sunnis of Iraq, Jordan, and Syria draw closer to oppose the Shiites of Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. We could be entering a new age of Middle East border drawing, the do-it-yourself version, where the borders of the Middle East get redrawn not by colonial outsiders from the top down, but by the Middle Easterners themselves, from the bottom up. Mr. Friedman has been a New York Times columnist for many years, and I assure you, he did not always write with such attention to the distribution of Sunni and Shi'i around the Middle East. A perhaps apocryphal story has circulated of a discussion of the then impending Iraq War between President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Adolfo Suarez Gonzalez of Spain. Prime Minister Suarez favored the invasion, but he warned Bush to be prepared. Iraq had a ruling Sunni minority population and a large oppressed Shi'i majority, to which President Bush reportedly replied, "But I thought they were all Muslims." Out of respect for the president, let us declare this story indeed apocryphal. It remains, nonetheless, that many policy-making positions in the United States had virtually no grasp of this key religious distinction until very recently. Now they do. But what difference does it make to appreciate the distinction if you have no sense of how religious identity and national identity can be managed in a society, so as to avoid the suicide pact that the Syrians seem to be imposing on one another even as we speak? Identity is the key question. I do hope, and I do think I discern, an answer to that question emerging in Turkey, thanks in part to the thought of Fethullah Gülen. And having said just this much, let me invite you to express your thoughts and comments on the same subject. We're all friends. Let us be candid and trusting, as only friends can be.
There's a little something I would like to add to what I managed to put in that paper. It could have been a very large something, but I'll make it brief. One feature of our culture today is that we are all, in a way, custodians of each other's identities, and that means that we become custodians of the stories that lie behind those identities. This is what we mean in the slangy American way when we say, "I see where you're coming from," or "I understand where you're coming from." That's a kind of geographical or motion metaphor, but it actually refers to narrative and to a passage not across space but through time. And there is, I believe, if we consider the point to which Turkey has now arrived and the American story with regard to religion and nationality, some particular reason to look forward to a deepening friendship. And this difference I see as consisting of Turkey's passage from secularism to religious neutrality. There is a difference between secularism and religious neutrality, I believe, and you can see this in a way in the difference between the reaction in France to the presence of the hijab in French public schools and the reaction in the United States. Americans don't care. It doesn't mean that Americans don't care about religion. It doesn't mean that Americans don't care about American national identity either, but they don't see what you have or don't have on your head as a threat to national identity in the way that the French do. This is because at the time of the French Revolution, and then even more in 1905, when the French policy of laïcité, or secularity, was introduced, the position taken by the country was that its identity consisted importantly of a repudiation of religion. Whereas in the American tradition, the understanding was that the government took no position on that subject. All religions could thrive here, and if you chose to have no religion, you could thrive in that condition as well. Atheists were welcome, and atheists can legally become president of the United States. But what matters is not any particular position that is taken with regard to religion by the government. In the First Amendment to the American Constitution, it is stipulated that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That is, then there is to be no national American religion, nor abridging the free exercise thereof. So government is not going to interfere with you if you have a religion and you wish to practice it. Turkey's heritage in the 20th century, Kemalism, and after, has been heavily indebted to the French model, as I think is widely appreciated now, and has, in that sense, been antagonistic toward religion. I hesitate to say, not knowing enough, but you may have opinions on this, whether Turkish secularism is more favorably disposed to Islam than it is to Christianity in Turkey, or Alawite-ism, for example. In any case, the national stance, the national identity has consisted to some extent of this repudiation. And if that repudiation is now being taken out of the national identity, what can be replacing it? That seems to be the question that arises. And the AK party seems to be suggesting that religious pluralism can replace it. So that you have the paradox then that the state is still without a national religion, and just as the United States is without a national religion, but can be more benignly disposed toward Islam, because in the same moment it's also more benignly disposed toward other religions that have been practiced in the past in Turkey, and still in some small numbers are even to this day. So if this process is successfully carried forward, then the political system in the United States with regard to religion and nationality, and the political system in Turkey, will come into closer alignment. The process by which this has happened has very, very little, negligibly little, to do with American influence in Turkey, so far as I can tell. It's a point to which Turkey has arrived on its own, but at the end of the day, we can see a rather bright prospect for a common cause. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure.